Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first edition of what we'll call the Weekend Lecture Series. Today we're going to talk about the Reign of Terror and the Radical Revolution in France. And we're actually going to pick up very much where the last class ended, talking about how women had an important role in the French Revolution. And much how we talked about the Declaration of the Rights of Women, talked about women becoming more involved as to what's going on, we're going to see the big motivating factor in the early parts of this lecture is women. And that is going to be that women are going to be the ones involved in society, and they're still aware as to what's going on, while the men are off doing ridiculous things in the government and, catastrophically destroying it. Well, what we see are women are going to be at home with their children, and they are dealing with the fact that the economy of France has fallen apart entirely. Bread prices are skyrocketing, people can't get food, everything is a disaster, so what do? They think at the most realistic way that they can make a change in France, and that is to get food from the one place in all of France that they are aware food still exists. And guess where that is? You got it. It's Versailles. So, knowing that Louis would by no means be starving himself, because, one, he could probably go 6 months without food and never even notice it, but we know that Versailles is stocked with food, and so do the people of Paris. So, women in Paris are going to march to Versailles, take that 20-mile trek on down the road, and when they do so, they will surround the Versailles Palace. And this is going to scare the crap out of Marie and Louis because the people are demanding food. Well, as much food as exists in Versailles, there's not enough for 7,000 people to eat, let alone all the people back in Paris. So whatever is mustered up can be mustered up and is given to the crowds, but the crowds demand more, and what they demand is that Louis and Marie come back with them to Paris. And they're given a very simple ultimatum. Come back with us, or we burn you alive in your beautiful house. Debating on what to do, they decide to go to Versailles and get their carriage and then peace off to Paris. Well, on their trip back to Paris, things in France are going to begin to change. This is going to mark a period of dramatic changes throughout all of France. The government itself is going to go through a significant transitional period here. The monarchy is going to end, the absolute monarchy, per se. Instead, we're going to see a constitutional monarchy where much of the power of the actual monarchy is given away to something called the Legislative Assembly. This Legislative Assembly is going to be an elected body by the people that is going to actually run the day-to-day operations of France. And this is going to be a dramatic change. It's never happened like this in France before. Normally we see the nobility running things when the king doesn't. Well, now there is no nobility, so here's what we have. And this is also going to introduce a new idea called active and passive citizenry, which is going to be new to really anything that we've seen in France at this point, or really anything that we've seen all of Europe. How this comes out is that prior to the revolution, the nobility were the only other real source of power outside of the king. Well, after the revolution, or at least during the revolution, these ideas are going to be that if you are an active participant in the economy, you should have a right to vote. So those who work enough to actually have to pay income taxes, whether you're a landowner, whether you're an owner of a business, whether you're just an active shop owner, shop worker, whatever, but you actually pay taxes, you now have a right to vote. And this is going to make it so that roughly 50,000 people are going to have some influence on how the government plays out. Well, then from those 50,000 people, those who are landowners now have the opportunity to become part of the Legislative Assembly itself. So now you're opening up to significantly more people than you ever did in France before, and it's no longer passed from generation to generation. But sadly, during this, again, women, apparently you don't exist yet. The French Revolution was not one for women's rights, as you are now well aware. Well, this isn't the only change that's going to take place in France. We're also going to see those parliaments that plagued Louis XV and XVI gone. They're going to be replaced by something called departments, and these departments are kind of like 83 functional states in France, where each state has its own little government, but that government is directly responsible back to the central government. They are equally distributed in population and land as best as humanly possible, and it's supposed to be more bureaucratic function as opposed to holding noble power or something like that as a source of power. And also, unions and guilds are gone. The Chapelier law, again I apologize if I butcher that name, is going to abolish these because they believe they were symbolic of an older age, and we don't want that anymore. It's now going to actually be what we would consider a free capitalist government in France for, a month or so. because then everyone just dies. Well, outside of that, the most dramatic change that we see in France, and this is going to be the most dramatic change in the entire French Revolution, is going to be the relationship between the government and the church. And the Legislative Assembly is going to do pretty much everything you could ever imagine as the wrong solution as to how to deal with the church. And then this is eventually going to be improved upon by Napoleon, who pretty much does everything you could ever want a government leader to do in regards to respecting the ideas of a church. Well, the Legislative Assembly believed that the church was an opportunity to fix some problems in France. They are going to use the church as a debt solution problem, or debt problem solution. They are going to confiscate the land and property of the church, sell them, use that money to pay off the national debt, and then stabilize the economy. In doing so, they're going to create things called assignats, and those assignats are going to be documents that allow you to effectively sell your portion of church property that was bestowed upon you in resolution of a debt from the government. And we almost see them creating a form of currency that is effectively bartering back and forth parts of the Catholic Church. Well, it's safe to say the Vatican was not okay with this, and it's only going to get worse. Well, if the Vatican's not okay with it, you should also be aware that the French citizenry, who is 99% Catholic, is probably not going to be okay with this too. This only is going to get worse, though. The new Legislative Assembly is going to create something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, where they are going to actually take the church aspects of things away and actually make the Catholic Church in France part of the government. And as part of the government, they are now responsible to the Legislative Assembly for what they say and do. They have to swear an oath of allegiance to the Legislative Assembly in the new Constitution, and disregard anything that might be different from what they believe that might be espoused from the Vatican or from anywhere else in Europe. Well, that is not going to go well in a lot of places. Particularly every other country in Europe thinks that's a pretty awful idea. And this is actually going to create a lot of resistance to what is happening in the French Revolution to the rest of Europe. It was just a big old disaster for everyone involved, and probably was the signing of your own death warrant if you're a member of the Legislative Assembly. And things will not get any better. With this debacle, things in France are going to devolve. The rest of Europe is now going to view the French Revolution as a plague upon Europe. It is now the public enemy of the other major powers of Europe, who are really concerned as to what's about to happen here. Because if you're in Austria, you're afraid for the life of your sister Marie. If you're in every other country in Europe, you're afraid of what your own provincial survival might be. Because if this is successful in France, and the people overthrow the monarchy, what's going to stop them from doing this in your own country? So now paranoia is reaching the other major powers of Europe, and even in France, we're seeing the country split into pieces. Factions will break out throughout all of France. 3 different groups, the conservatives, the moderates, and the radicals, will start to split the Legislative Assembly apart. The conservatives want things to go back to the way they were. Pre-revolution France, Louis is the king, pretend like this stuff didn't happen. The moderates would like to continue kind of where we're at right now. Constitutional monarchy, some significant changes, but there's still a king, he's still Louis, we don't kill off people, and just kind of keep it at this pace. But then there's a third group called the radicals. These radicals are going to be the people that are going to become iconic to the French Revolution. They want to burn everything down and start from scratch. They have no interest in maintaining this or a monarchy or anything. And it's going to be these 3 groups and their different responses to how to deal with the problems of France, whether it's food or debt, and that's going to be what drives the French Revolution. Some people are going to see this factionalism as the last straw. There's going to be groups of people called the émigrés who are going to leave France in hopes of trying to rally support in the other nations of Europe to fight back against the French Revolution. Then there's also going to be the radicals themselves. They're going to be by various different names. But one of the more iconic ones are the sans-culottes. And in very classic French fashion, they are actually defined by how they dress themselves. And those of you guys who are French scholars would know that sans-culottes is actually a reference to the clothing without breeches, which would be clothing of the common person. So they're going to be shopkeepers, they're going to be random people who are tired of the way the old system worked and want things dramatically to change. Well, as this factionalism grows in France, the Legislative Assembly loses control, and these ideas that you're kind of seeing on this picture right here are really what's going to moderate Europe. The monarchy should burn, the world itself should be light afire with the ideas of revolution, and the clergy and kings and nobility should all be destroyed and started from scratch. Well, that sounds like fun, except not. So Louis like, I'm out of here. With the rise of the radicals in France, Louis decides that his best case scenario is to get out of France now. So he and Marie are going to get in one of their carriages and flee France. And they're going to try to get to Austria, knowing that that again is Marie's brother's kingdom. But sadly, they're a few miles short of the border, going to get caught. And they're going to get caught because of something as simple that Louis' face is on every single piece of money in all of France, and they're going to recognize him and drag him back to Paris. And when this happens, Louis' freedom and Marie's freedom for the rest of their life is gone. They are now going to be confined to their palace in Paris, the Tuileries, until eventually they get moved off to somewhere else. Well, when this happens, Marie's brother Joseph is going to lose it a little bit. He is going to make a declaration called the Declaration of Pillnitz, where he believes the European powers will all team up together to stop the French Revolution if there is ever a threat made against the lives of Louis and Marie. While this was a huge statement in that if it worked, it would destroy the French Revolution, but reality is the British would have never have cared if France burned to the ground, so it was never really going to happen. What did happen, though, is that France itself was absolutely petrified of this notion. So they're going to go ahead and just be really crazy, and things in France continue to lose control. The government itself is now completely being wiped out by a group of people called the Jacobins. They are the quintessential radical group in France. They are completely disregarding to anything that had existed prior and want everything to be burned down and started from scratch, and have no problem with the use of violence in order to do this. Themselves, they're going to create a new government. The Legislative Assembly is abandoned, the Constitution thrown out, and a new National Convention is created. And they're going to create a new Constitution that is voted on by every male citizen in France. Which sounds great in of itself, but how they get there is just a disaster. We're going to see chaos break out in Paris again. The palace where the king and queen are staying, the Tuileries, is going to be stormed by a mob. They are literally going to drag the king and queen to live in the Legislative Assembly for the rest of their life. There's going to be rumors throughout France that Europe's going to be invading France, and they believe that they're getting information from prisoners in jail, because that makes a lot of sense. So they killed them all of them. We call this the September Massacres, because, yeah, that happened. And then after this takes place, people in France are in such a panic state that they go ahead and decide that if we're going to be attacked, we might as well attack first. So the French army will invade the Austrian Netherlands. And in doing so, they will enlist the hatred of the Austrians, the Prussians, and the British still don't care. But now war is breaking out in Europe. And the French, realizing that they might have bit off a little bit more than they can chew, will actually institute the first military draft in the modern age. We call this the levée en masse. And as things begin to devolve, the Jacobins are going to consolidate their power, and there's actually a group of them called the Mountain. And this Mountain is going to be an extraordinarily radical group of people who are going to dictate what happens. And in their minds, the first thing you need to do in order to secure the revolution is to eliminate the monarchy. So Louis and Marie are going to be disenfranchised from their own heads. So, whoops, my bad. Nice knowing you. Yeah, that happened. And after that, the reign of power of France is going to be put in the hands of a man by the name of Maximilien Robespierre. And he's going to create something called the Committee of Public Safety, which is supposed to be dedicated to protecting the revolution and its ideals. In his mind, he created a republic of virtue that would eliminate any resemblances of the old society that he believed was corrupt and awful. And this period of time that we know Robespierre is known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror is going to be a period in France where everything is just a total disaster. Thousands of people are executed at the guillotine. We're talking hundreds a day. There would be a list, a waiting list, and it was actually a public spectacle to see who got their head chopped off on any given day. Many people executed were those who spoke out against Robespierre, but in reality, many of them were just random people. It didn't matter if they were nobles or peasants or whatever, they just died. And it becomes such a chaotic period in France that eventually the Reign of Terror will stop because the National Convention is so petrified of their own safety that they will chop off Robespierre's head. And it's really at this symbolic moment in the French Revolution that everything has gone wrong that possibly can. The government had become so radical that it has become disregarding of the actual needs of the people, and their own delusions of grandeur had made the revolution a disaster. But now things are going to change, and we're actually going to see a remodernization of the government and the introduction of probably the most iconic figure in all of European history, a little Sicilian general who is going to make a lasting impact on the rest of the world. Thanks and have a great weekend.